bitter December wind cut through Silver Creek like a cavalry saber on Christmas Eve, 1876, carrying promises of heavy snow and the distant sound of drunken caroling from the dusty Rose Saloon. Yellow lamplight spilled across the muddy main street, casting long shadows that danced with each gust of Arctic air sweeping down from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The warmth from those glowing windows didn't reach the darker corners of town, especially not the shadows behind the mining depot where 14-year-old Clara Hollis crouched beside a frozen trash barrel, her fingers numb and bloodied as she searched desperately for anything edible. 2 months of living rough had taught her to swallow pride along with whatever scraps she could find. The threadbare blue dress that had once been her Sunday best now hung loose on her thin frame, patched with whatever fabric she could scavenge from the town's refuse. Her auburn hair, once carefully braided by loving hands, now hung in tangled strands around a face that had aged years in just weeks. Her father's death in October had left her with nothing. Her stepmother, a woman who'd married Ezekiel Hollis more for security than love, had sold everything of value before disappearing with a traveling merchant, caring more about her own escape than the orphaned child left behind. Clara pulled out what might have been cornbread, brushing off ice crystals that had formed where someone's coffee dregs had frozen to the crust. She tried not to think about where it had been, what hands had touched it before being discarded. Survival had a way of stripping away such luxuries as disgust. As she reached for her coat pocket to store her meager find, heavy footsteps crunched through the slush behind her, deliberate and menacing. Well, well, well. Look what we got here. Little Clara Hollis rooting through garbage like some kind of wild animal. She spun around, clutching a broken bottle she'd found earlier. Not much of a weapon, but better than facing them empty-handed. Tom Bradley, Jonas Pike's lead enforcer, stood blocking her escape route with 2 other men she recognized from the mining company's payroll. Bradley was a big man with a scarred face that spoke of countless bar fights and back-alley beatings, his mouth twisted into an ugly grin that never reached his cold gray eyes. His breath formed thick clouds in the frigid air, and Clara could smell whiskey on him, even from several feet away. "Leave me be," Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I ain't bothering nobody." "Now that's where you're wrong, little girl." Bradley stepped closer, his boots squelching in the mixture of snow and mud that covered the alley. "Mr. Pike thinks you might know things. Important things about your daddy's business before he got himself killed." Clara's grip tightened on the broken glass, feeling its sharp edges bite into her palm. Her father had been shot dead during what everyone in town called a simple land dispute. But she'd always suspected there was more to it than that. Ezekiel Hollis had been asking too many questions about water rights and territorial boundaries in the weeks before his death, questions that had made certain powerful people nervous. "I don't know nothing about Daddy's business." She lied, though her voice wavered slightly. "Smart girl like you living in the same house." Bradley nodded to his companions, who began spreading out to circle behind her, like wolves cornering wounded prey. "I bet you heard plenty of conversations. Maybe even saw some papers that weren't meant for little girls' eyes." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was sure they could hear it. She had seen papers scattered from overturned crates just hours earlier while searching for food scraps behind the depot. Legal documents with territorial seals, land deeds with signatures that looked too fresh for their supposed dates correspondence, that seemed official but felt wrong somehow. Her father had taught her to read such documents, drilling into her the critical importance of understanding anything that could affect their ranch's ownership or water rights. "My daddy never talked business with me," she insisted, backing against the trash barrel. "Maybe not directly." Bradley's hand rested on the pistol at his hip, a casual gesture that was anything but casual. "But little mice have big ears, don't they? And Mr. Pike's heard you've been poking around where you don't belong, asking questions that might be dangerous for a girl in your position." One of the other men, a thin fellow with nervous eyes and a perpetual twitch, glanced around the empty alley. "We should make this quick, Tom. Folks might hear if she starts screaming. No rush at all. Bradley said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that somehow seemed more frightening than shouting. Time this town learned what happens to people who stick their noses in Mr. Pike's affairs, especially little orphan girls with no one to protect them. Before Clara could react, Bradley's hand shot out like a striking snake and grabbed her wrist, twisting hard enough to make her cry out and drop the bottle. The glass shattered on the frozen ground with a sound like breaking dreams. His other hand drew back as if to strike her face, and Clara braced herself for the blow that would surely be followed by far worse. Now then, let's have ourselves a proper conversation about them papers you found. And don't even think about lying to me again, girl. I can smell fear on you like cheap perfume. But before his fist could connect with her face, a new voice cut through the night air like a blade through silk, low gravelly, and carrying the kind of quiet authority that made dangerous men pause and reconsider their actions. The child said to leave her alone. From the deeper shadows between buildings emerged a figure that seemed carved from darkness itself. The man was tall and lean, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had survived battles that would have killed lesser mortals, despite an obvious limp in his left leg that spoke of old wounds and older pain. His weathered face bore the scars of cavalry bullets and Apache arrows, while his dark eyes held depths that suggested he had seen too much death and not enough justice in his years. A buckskin jacket adorned with eagle feathers marked him as Navajo, while the Spencer rifle in his hands marked him as extremely dangerous to anyone foolish enough to underestimate him. "This ain't your concern, Injun." Bradley snarled, releasing Clara's wrist, but keeping his hand on his pistol. "Walk away while you still can. A child in danger is always my concern." The Navajo replied, his voice remaining calm and steady despite the obvious threat. The rifle barrel never wavered from its target, Bradley's chest, right where his heart should be if he had one. "Walk away. Now." Clara had seen this man around town, Yaji, she thought his name was. He worked as a scout and day laborer, keeping mostly to himself and speaking to few people beyond what business required. Most folks gave him a wide berth, partly from the usual frontier prejudice against Indians, and partly because something in his bearing warned against casual conversation. There were stories about him, whispered rumors of a warrior past, and tragedies that had driven him from his people to wander the territory alone. "You got no authority here," Bradley said, though Clara caught the uncertainty creeping into his voice. 3 against 1 should have been excellent odds, but there was something about Yaji that made smart men think twice about their chances. "My authority comes from conscience," Yaji replied, stepping fully into the lamplight that spilled from a nearby window. Clara could see the careful way he favored his right side, the old wounds that hadn't healed quite right, despite the passage of years. "And from this rifle. Both are sufficient for present purposes." Bradley weighed his options, carefully glancing at his companions for support. The nervous man was already edging away from the confrontation, clearly wanting no part of a gunfight with a Navajo warrior, who looked like he'd survived worse odds than these. The third fellow looked tough enough in his own right, but his eyes kept darting to the rifle pointed at Bradley's heart, calculating distances and angles, and finding them all wanting. "Mr. Pike won't like you interfering in company business," Bradley warned, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "Mr. Pike is welcome to discuss his concerns with me personally," Yaji said with the kind of deadly calm that made smart men very nervous. "After you leave the girl alone and walk away from this alley." The standoff stretched taut as piano wire, each second feeling like an hour to Clara as she crouched against the trash barrel. She could hear her own heartbeat, the distant sound of Christmas songs from the saloon, the whistle of cold air through the narrow space between buildings. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Bradley jerked his head toward his men in a gesture of frustrated retreat. "Oh, this ain't over, girl," he said, his voice carrying across the alley with the weight of a promise rather than a threat. Pike has a long memory and an even longer reach. You can't hide behind your Injun friend forever. As the three men disappeared back into the shadows from which they'd come, Clara felt her legs turn to water beneath her. The broken bottle slipped from her numb fingers, adding its fragments to those already scattered across the frozen ground. Yaji lowered his rifle and approached her carefully, the way someone might approach a wounded animal that could either flee or attack, depending on how threatened it felt. "Easy, little one," he said gently, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there when he'd been facing down Bradley and his men. "You are safe now." Clara looked up at her unlikely savior, taking in the weathered features that spoke of hardships she could barely imagine. There were lines around his eyes that came from squinting into desert sun and prairie wind scars on his hands that told stories of old battles and older griefs. "Why did you help me?" Yaji was quiet for a long moment, studying her face, as if trying to read something written there in languages he'd almost forgotten. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and older regrets. "Because a man who fails to protect children when he has the power to do so is no man at all." Something in his tone suggested personal experience with such failure, but Clara was too shaken by her near escape to pursue the matter further. "They said I knew things about my father's business, but I don't know nothing that would matter to important folks like Pike. What did you see tonight?" Yazi asked, his voice gentle but insistent. "Bradley mentioned you'd been poking around where you shouldn't. What papers were they talking about?" Clara hesitated, torn between the instinctive wariness of a child who'd learned the hard way that adults couldn't always be trusted, and the growing sense that this man might be different from the others who'd failed her since her father's death. Finally, she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Papers," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hidden in crates behind the mining depot. I was looking for food scraps and knocked some boxes over by accident. Legal documents spilled everywhere, land deeds, water rights, territorial grants. But something was wrong with them." Yazi's expression darkened, and Clara could see the wheels turning behind his dark eyes. "Wrong how?" "Dates that didn't match what I remembered from when Daddy was alive, signatures that looked too fresh on paper that was supposed to be old. And I heard voices while I was trying to gather them up Pike, talking to some men about submitting documents to the territorial judge after New Year's. He was laughing about how easy it was to steal land from people who couldn't read legal papers properly." The pieces clicked together in Yazi's experienced mind, like the components of a rifle being assembled for battle. A conspiracy vast enough to steal thousands of acres from honest settlers and tribal lands alike, perpetrated through forged documents and corrupt officials. And this child, this brave, desperate child, had stumbled onto evidence that could expose the whole rotten scheme and bring down one of the most powerful men in the territory. "Come," he said, offering Clara his arm with the careful courtesy of a man who understood that trust was a precious commodity, not to be wasted. "I know someone who can help us. Someone we can trust." They moved through Silver Creek's back alleys like shadows themselves, avoiding the main street where Pike's men might be watching and waiting. The schoolhouse sat at the town's edge, a modest wooden building that served as both classroom and residence for the teacher who had dedicated her life to educating frontier children despite the hardships and dangers that came with such a calling. Maureen Callahan answered Yazi's soft knock immediately, her brown eyes taking in the situation with the quick assessment of someone long accustomed to dealing with children in various states of crisis. She was a handsome woman in her early 30s, with prematurely gray hair and laugh lines that spoke of someone who managed to find joy and hope, even in the most difficult circumstances. "Bring her inside quickly," Maureen said, stepping aside to let them pass. Half the town's buzzing about Pike's men searching for someone, though they're not saying who or why. The schoolhouse interior was sparse but warm, heated by a wood stove that cast dancing shadows on walls lined with children's drawings of frontier life cowboys and Indians' mountains and Rivers families gathered around dinner tables that spoke of dreams of better times ahead. Maureen immediately began preparing hot tea, while Yaji positioned himself near the frost-covered window, watching for any signs of pursuit. "Now then," Maureen said once Clara had stopped shivering enough to hold a cup steady. "Tell us everything you saw and heard. Don't leave out any details, no matter how small they might seem." Clara's story unfolded like a detailed map of corruption and greed. The scattered documents she discovered included dozens of forged land deeds, all bearing Pike's distinctive wax seal, and all transferring ownership of valuable properties to his mining company for ridiculously small sums. Some bore the signatures of men she knew to be dead. Others were dated impossibly, documents supposedly signed weeks or even months after their purported authors had been buried in Silver Creek Cemetery. I recognized some of the names. Clara continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. Ranchers who died this past year under suspicious circumstances. Navajo families from the reservation who supposedly sold their grazing rights. Even some Mexican landowners down south who were said to have moved back to Mexico. All of them supposedly selling their property to Pike for almost nothing. Yazi and Maureen exchanged meaningful glances, both of them understanding the full implications of what Clara was describing. If those forged documents reached Territorial Judge Morrison during his scheduled New Year's circuit, hundreds of families would lose their homes and livelihoods through what appeared to be perfectly legal transactions. "There's something else," Clara added quietly, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. "While I was hiding behind the crates trying to stay out of sight, I heard Pike talking about my father specifically. He said Daddy had been asking too many questions about water rights around town, getting too close to understanding the whole operation. That's why they had to eliminate him permanently." The confirmation of murder hung heavy in the warm air of the schoolhouse like smoke from a funeral pyre. Maureen reached out and took Clara's hands in her own, noting the cuts and calluses that no 14-year-old should have to bear, the signs of too much hardship crammed into too few years. "You're safe now," she said firmly, though her voice carried more hope than certainty. "We won't let them hurt you." But even as she spoke the words, all three of them knew that safety was nothing more than a comfortable illusion in Pike's Silver Creek. The mining foreman controlled Sheriff Dregg through a combination of bribes and blackmail, owned most of the town council through similar means, and kept enough hired guns on his payroll to silence anyone who threatened his carefully constructed empire of corruption and theft. "What do we do now?" Clara asked, looking back and forth between her two unlikely protectors. Yaji was methodically cleaning his rifle with the practiced efficiency of a man whose life had often depended on his weapon's reliability. "We gather more evidence, build support among the honest townspeople who are left, and expose Pike's conspiracy before he can submit those documents to Judge Morrison." "And if he finds us first?" Maureen asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then we fight." Yaji replied simply, his voice carrying the calm acceptance of someone who had faced such odds before. "Some things are worth dying for. Justice is one of them." Outside the schoolhouse, the Christmas Eve celebration continued in blissful ignorance of the conspiracy unfolding in their midst. But inside, three unlikely allies prepared for a battle that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of everyone who called Silver Creek home. Clara pulled the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders and stared into the dancing flames of the wood stove, trying to find warmth for her soul, as well as her body. Tomorrow she would have to find the courage to face the men who had murdered her father and stolen her home. She was 14 years old, alone in the world, except for a Navajo warrior and an Irish schoolteacher who had risked everything to protect her. But she was also Ezekiel Hollis's daughter, and her father had not raised her to run from a fight when justice and the lives of innocent people were at stake. Their refuge in the schoolhouse lasted exactly 11 hours and 23 minutes. Clara woke on Christmas morning to the sound of hoofbeats thundering through the snow, outside, the rhythm urgent and purposeful in a way that spoke of men on a mission they had no intention of failing. Through the frost-covered windows, They could see Sheriff Calvin Dregg leading a posse of 6 men, their rifles glinting ominously in the pale winter sunlight. Pike had clearly wasted no time in mobilizing his forces for a systematic search of the town. The back door. Yazi said, simply checking his rifle one final time. Move quietly and stay low. They slipped out through the rear entrance just as Dregg's boots thundered across the front porch. Clara could hear furniture being overturned inside the schoolhouse as the men conducted their search, looking under every desk and behind every bookshelf for signs of their quarry. Maureen led them through her small vegetable garden, now buried under 2 feet of snow that crunched softly beneath their feet despite their efforts at stealth. "But where can we go?" Maureen whispered, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Yazi studied the terrain with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years reading landscapes for signs of danger and opportunity. Silver Creek ran along the town's eastern edge, its surface frozen solid by weeks of December cold. Beyond the creek lay rolling hills covered with scattered stands of pine trees, good country for hiding, but also terrain that would be easy to track through in the snow. The creek, he decided after a moment's consideration. If we can cross before they pick up our trail, we might be able to lose them in the hills. The ice might not hold our weight. Maureen protested, eyeing the frozen surface dubiously. "It'll hold better than our chances if we stay here," Yazi replied grimly. Behind them, they could hear Dregg's voice shouting orders to his men. "Fan out and search every building, check the alleys, the root cellars, anywhere they might be hiding. They can't have gone far on foot." The creek bank was steep and slippery, covered with a treacherous mixture of snow and ice that made every step a potential disaster. Clara nearly fell twice during the descent, saved only by Yazi's steadying hand and her own desperate determination not to become a burden to her protectors. The frozen surface of the creek stretched before them like a white highway to safety if they could trust it not to collapse under their combined weight. "Stay close to me," Yazi instructed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Step exactly where I step, and if you hear cracking, don't run. Running will break the ice for certain. Move quickly but carefully, and whatever you do, don't look back." They stepped onto the frozen creek together, Clara positioned in the middle with Yazi and Maureen flanking her on either side. The ice held for the first few tentative steps, groaning ominously but supporting their weight. Then came the sound Yazi had been dreading, a sharp crack that echoed off the canyon walls like a rifle shot. "Keep moving," he said calmly, though Clara could hear the tension creeping into his voice, despite his efforts to remain reassuring. More cracks began appearing beneath their feet, spider webbing across the surface in patterns that seemed to follow their every step. The ice was weakening dangerously with each footfall, and they were still 20 feet from the relative safety of the opposite bank. Behind them, Dregg's men had reached the creek bank and spotted their desperate attempt at escape. "Stop right there," Dregg shouted, raising his Winchester to his shoulder. "Come back peaceful and nobody gets hurt." Yazi's response was to push Clara forward more quickly, even as the ice began to sag visibly beneath their weight. The first rifle shot rang out across the frozen landscape, the bullet whining off the icy surface near Clara's feet and sending up a shower of crystalline fragments. "They're shooting at us." Clara gasped, struggling to keep her balance, as more cracks appeared around her feet. "Keep moving," Yazi replied grimly, his own balance precarious as his wounded legs struggled with the uncertain footing. "They want us alive if possible, so they'll aim to wound rather than kill. But wounded prisoners are still prisoners." More shots followed in rapid succession. Dregg's men had spread out along the bank to get better angles for their marksmanship. One bullet struck the ice directly in front of Maureen, sending cracks radiating outward like a spider's web and causing the schoolteacher to stumble. She cried out as she felt the surface give way beneath her left foot, icy water immediately flooding her boot. "Maureen." Clara turned back instinctively, forgetting Yazi's instructions in her concern for the woman who had shown her such kindness. "Don't stop. Yaji commanded, but he too was slowing to help the struggling woman. Keep moving toward the bank. Another bullet whined past Clara's ear so close that she could feel the wind of its passage, followed immediately by the crack of more ice giving way. Then came the sound of complete disaster, a deep, groaning crack that seemed to run the entire width of the creek. The ice was giving way catastrophically, and they were still 10 feet from safety. Maureen's section collapsed first. She plunged through to her waist, the shock of the icy water driving all air from her lungs in a strangled cry. Her hands clawed desperately at the remaining ice edge as the swift current beneath tried to drag her under and away into the darkness below. I can't hold on much longer. She gasped, her face already going pale from the cold. Clara didn't hesitate for even a moment. Dropping to her belly to spread her weight across the weakening surface, she crawled toward the opening where Maureen was struggling. "Grab my hand. I won't let you fall." "Clara, no," Yaji shouted, seeing more cracks spreading out from the girl's position like fault lines in an earthquake. "The ice won't hold both of you." But Clara had already reached Maureen, gripping the teacher's wrists with both hands and all the desperate strength she possessed. The ice groaned ominously under their combined weight, sagging visibly as more cracks appeared, but it held just long enough for Yaji to reach them. With his greater size and strength, he hauled both females toward what remained of solid ice, his wounded legs screaming in protest with every movement. Behind them, one of Dregg's deputies had grown impatient with the long-range shooting and ventured onto the creek bed in direct pursuit, his horse's hooves managing to find purchase on what seemed like solid surface. But the animal's weight was far too much for ice that was already compromised with a tremendous crack that could be heard for miles, and the surface gave way entirely beneath them. The deputy's scream was cut short as the frigid water closed over both horse and rider. His companions on the bank shouted and reached for him, but the swift current beneath the ice swept both man and animal away into the churning rapids below before any rescue could be attempted. Clara's own section of ice was collapsing now, on the surface tilting at crazy angles as she felt herself sliding backward toward the dark water. Panic overwhelmed her as the cold began closing around her legs, the current trying to pull her down into the same fate that had claimed the deputy. "I got you." Yaji lunged forward with desperate strength, grabbing Clara's coat collar just as she went completely under. The icy water was like liquid fire against her skin, shocking her system and driving all rational thought from her mind. With strength born of desperation, Yaji dragged her back onto what remained of solid ice, then bodily threw both females toward the far bank. He made the crossing himself with only seconds to spare his wounded leg, finally giving out completely as he hauled himself up the muddy bank through sheer force of will. They were all soaked to the skin, freezing and exhausted. But they were alive, which was more than could be said for Dregg's deputy. On the far side of the creek, Dregg could be heard cursing creatively, but the sheriff was far too cautious and self-preserving to risk the crossing himself. His remaining deputies showed similar reluctance to follow their comrade's example after witnessing his dramatic disappearance beneath the ice. "There's a bridge about 2 miles downstream," Maureen said through teeth that chattered so violently she could barely form words. "They'll circle around and pick up our trail on this side." Yaji struggled to his feet, his face gray with pain, but his resolve clearly unchanged by their ordeal. "Then we cannot afford to stay here. How far to the nearest shelter?" Clara tried to think through the fog of adrenaline shock and rapidly advancing hypothermia. Her father had been an avid hunter who knew these hills better than anyone, and she had accompanied him on enough expeditions to have a reasonable knowledge of the terrain. "There's an old line shack about 3 miles north of here. It's been abandoned for years, but it might still have a roof and walls. Can you make it that far?" Yazi asked, studying the exhausted girl with the careful attention of someone who understood that pushing too hard could be as dangerous as not pushing hard enough. Clara straightened her shoulders with a determination that reminded him painfully of warriors he had known and lost. "I can make it. I ain't planning to die in this snow." The trek through knee-deep drifts tested all three of them in ways they hadn't expected. Clara's wet clothes began freezing to her body, turning every movement into an exercise in pain as ice crystals formed in the fabric. Each step sent needles of agony through her legs, but she gritted her teeth and kept moving. Maureen, despite her Irish constitution and years of frontier living, struggled with the uneven terrain and bitter cold that seemed to cut through her very bones. But it was Yaji who suffered most visibly. His old cavalry wound, combined with the tremendous strain of their desperate escape, left him barely able to walk without assistance. They took turns supporting each other through the worst sections, sharing body warmth and encouragement as they pushed through the wilderness that could kill them as easily as Pike's guns. The line shack finally appeared through the swirling snow. Like a mirage, its roof partially collapsed from years of neglect, but its walls still standing against the elements. Inside, they found enough dry wood to build a small fire in the old stone hearth, along with some supplies that previous travelers had cached against emergency salt pork, hardtack, and a small pouch of coffee beans that seemed like treasures beyond price. Clara huddled as close to the flames as she dared, while Maureen used her teacher's practical skills to organize their meager resources. "Why are you helping me?" Clara asked, watching Yaji methodically clean and oil his rifle with movements so practiced they seemed almost ritualistic. "You don't even know me, and helping me could get you killed." Yaji was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands moving with the efficient precision of someone whose life had often depended on his weapon's reliability. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief that had never fully healed. 12 years ago, during what the government called the Long Walk, when the army forced my people to march to Bosque Redondo, I had a daughter about your age. Her name was Ayana, which means eternal blossom in our language. She was beautiful and brave, and trusted me to protect her from everything the world might bring against us. Clara waited patiently, sensing there was more to the story, and that pushing would only cause him to retreat back into silence. The conditions at Bosque Redondo were designed to break us, to destroy our culture and our connection to the land that had sustained our people for generations. There was never enough food, never clean water, never adequate shelter against the cold. Disease spread through the camps like wildfire, and children died every day from ailments that could have been easily treated if we'd had proper medicine or been allowed to return to our traditional healing grounds. Yaji's voice dropped almost to a whisper. Ayana fell sick with fever during our second winter there. I tried everything I could think of to save her. I begged the army doctors for medicine. I traded away my weapons and my horse for food that might give her strength to fight the sickness. I even swallowed my pride and pleaded with the Indian agent to let me take her back to our ancestral lands where the healing plants grew. But they refused every request, and I was forced to watch my daughter waste away in my arms because I could not protect her from what they called progress. Clara felt tears stinging her eyes. "I'm sorry. That must have been terrible." She died holding my hand, whispering that she forgave me for failing her. But I could not forgive myself. I swore on her grave that I would never again stand by and watch a child suffer when I had the power to prevent it, no matter what the cost to myself might be. The fire crackled softly in the silence that followed, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the old shack. Clara understood now why this scarred warrior had risked his life for a white girl he barely knew. She represented a chance for redemption, an opportunity to keep a promise made to a dying child 12 years ago. "Your father raised you to be strong and to fight for what is right," Yaji continued. "That is exactly what we are going to do, no matter how dangerous it becomes." Over the next day, while they waited for the immediate search to die down, they refined their strategy and discussed their limited options. Pike would naturally expect them to run to try escaping the territory entirely before he could eliminate them. Instead, they would do the opposite, return to Silver Creek and expose his conspiracy before Territorial Judge Morrison arrived for his scheduled New Year's circuit. It's incredibly dangerous. Maureen pointed out her practical teacher's mind, cataloging all the ways their plan could go wrong. Pike controls the sheriff and most of the town council. He has men with guns who will shoot us on sight. But he doesn't control everyone. Clara replied, thinking of the families she had known all her life. There are still good people in Silver Creek ranchers who've been threatened, shopkeepers who've been forced to pay protection. Money parents who want their children to grow up in a community based on justice rather than fear. If we can reach them, show them the evidence. If we can stay alive long enough. Yaji added grimly, but there was approval in his voice. The girl was thinking like a tactical commander considering resources and allies, rather than just obstacles and enemies. Their plans changed dramatically on December 27th, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the morning quiet around their temporary refuge. Through gaps in the shack's weathered walls, they could see 6 riders spread out in a professional search formation, following their trail through the snow with the persistence of hunting hounds who had caught a scent. Pike's men. Clara whispered, recognizing Tom Bradley's distinctive black coat and the military precision with which the searchers moved. They found us. Yaji quickly assessed their tactical situation, 5 shots remaining in his rifle against 6 armed and experienced men in open country, with minimal cover and limited escape routes. The odds were poor by any reasonable calculation, but he had faced worse during his years as an Army scout and Navajo warrior. Take Maureen and head for that canyon to the north. He instructed Clara, pointing toward a narrow gap between 2 hills. Stay low, move fast, and don't look back no matter what you hear behind you. We're not leaving you to fight them alone. Clara said firmly, her young voice carrying an authority that would have been impressive in someone twice her age. You are, if you want to live long enough to expose Pike's conspiracy and save this town. Yazi replied, though there was warmth in his voice despite the harsh words. 1 man with a good rifle can delay 6 riders long enough for you to reach safety, but 3 people together will just make easier targets. But before they could argue the point further, Bradley's voice echoed across the snowy landscape with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the advantages. We know you're in there. Come out with your hands up, and Mr. Pike promises nobody gets hurt unnecessarily. Pike's promises aren't worth the paper they're not written on. Clara called back, surprising both her companions with her boldness and earning an appreciative chuckle from Yaji. Bradley's laughter in response was cold and without humor. Feisty little thing, aren't you, just like your daddy was before we put him in the ground? Too bad he didn't teach you when to keep your mouth shut. The casual admission of her father's murder hit Clara like a physical blow. But instead of breaking her spirit, it crystallized her resolve into something harder than the ice they had crossed earlier. These men had taken everything from her. Her father, her home, her childhood, and she would not let them intimidate her into surrender. My father was twice the man Pike will ever be. She shouted back, her voice carrying clearly across the distance. And you're nothing but hired killers working for a coward who's too scared to do his own dirty work. The response was immediate, and violent rifle fire erupted from multiple positions as Bradley's men opened up on the line shack with professional efficiency. Bullets punched through the thin wooden walls like they were made of paper, sending splinters flying and forcing the 3 defenders to take cover behind the old stone hearth. Yaji returned fire, methodically making each shot count, with the precision of someone who had learned marksmanship in battles where ammunition was scarce, and accuracy meant the difference between life and death. His first bullet took one of the attackers in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him tumbling from his horse with a scream of pain and rage. The second shot killed a mount rather than its rider, but the effect was the same. Another attacker was effectively removed from the fight as he found himself trapped behind the thrashing, dying animal. We can't hold them off forever, Maureen pointed out, pressing herself against the stone wall as bullets continued to pepper their position. They'll eventually work their way around behind us. We don't have to hold them forever." Yaji replied carefully, reloading his rifle, despite the continuing gunfire. "Just long enough." Clara peered through a gap in the wall, studying the terrain with a tactical eye her father had unknowingly trained through years of hunting trips and lessons about reading the land. The line shack sat in a natural depression between two hills, offering some protection from direct assault, but also limiting their escape routes. However, those same hills were covered with loose shale and precariously balanced rocks, the kind of geological formation that could be extremely dangerous if properly disturbed. "The rock slide," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the sound of gunfire. "Daddy used to warn me about those loose rocks on the north slope every time we hunted through here. He said they were just waiting for the right excuse to come down." Yazi followed her gaze, and his weathered face split into a grim smile of understanding and approval. "Can you and Maureen reach the base of that slope without being seen by the shooters? If we go out the back of the shack and crawl through that drainage ditch, we should be able to stay below their line of sight." Clara replied, already mentally plotting their route. "Then do it. When I give you the signal, 3 rapid shots followed by a pause, start throwing rocks at the loose section near the top of the slope. Even small stones can trigger a major avalanche if they're placed correctly and with enough force." It was a desperate plan born of desperate circumstances, but desperate times had a way of calling for measures that would seem insane under normal conditions. Clara and Maureen slipped out the back of the shack, while Yaji maintained a steady rate of covering fire, keeping Bradley's men focused on the building rather than the surrounding terrain. They low-crawled through the snow-filled drainage ditch, hearts pounding as bullets whistled overhead and ricocheted off rocks with deadly whines. The journey seemed to take forever, every yard covered in exercise in terror as they waited for one of the shooters to spot their movement and adjust his aim accordingly. The base of the unstable slope was littered with loose stones and broken shale that had been weathered free from the main formation over countless seasons of freeze and thaw. Clara selected the largest rock she could lift and carry, while Maureen gathered an armload of smaller but more numerous missiles. They crouched in position, waiting for Yazi's signal and trying to ignore the sound of bullets striking dangerously close to their hidden position. When the signal finally came, 3 rapid rifle shots, followed by an ominous silence, they began hurling their collected stones at the critical section of loose rock near the top of the slope, with all the strength and accuracy they possessed. At first, nothing seemed to happen except for small cascades of pebbles and dust. Then Clara's third throw, a rock about the size of a man's head, struck what must have been a key support stone in exactly the right place. The hillside began to move. What started as a few boulders rolling slowly down the slope quickly built into something far more dramatic, as those initial stones struck others and momentum began building exponentially. Within seconds, half the hillside was in motion, creating a thunderous roar that could be heard for miles and sending up a cloud of dust that blocked out the winter sun. Bradley's men had perhaps 3 seconds of warning before disaster struck them with the force of an avalanche. They had been so focused on the gun battle with their hidden opponent that none of them had been watching the slopes above their positions. 2 horses went down immediately, crushed beneath tons of falling rock and debris. Their riders managed to leap clear at the last possible moment, but one man was not quite fast enough to escape the cascade entirely. The rock slide caught him just as he was scrambling for safety, sweeping him away in a tumbling mass of stone and snow and timber. His scream was cut short almost immediately, as the larger boulders found their mark, leaving nothing but a bloody smear on the rocks and the echo of his final cry hanging in the suddenly quiet air. When the dust finally settled and the last of the loose rock had found its resting place, Bradley's attacking force was scattered and demoralized. One man was dead, crushed beyond recognition under tons of stone. 2 others were wounded, one seriously, and their carefully planned assault had been turned into a disaster by the quick thinking of a 14-year-old girl and her desperate allies. None time to go. Yazi announced, emerging from the bullet-riddled line shack with his rifle, ready for any renewed hostilities. They won't be following us anytime soon. But Pike has more men, and he won't make the same mistakes twice. The three fugitives made their escape through the canyon, while Bradley's survivors attempted to regroup and tend to their wounded. But their tactical victory was likely to be temporary at best. Pike commanded extensive resources and would certainly send more searchers once Bradley reported back about the failed ambush. As they picked their way carefully through the rocky terrain, Clara found herself thinking about her father and the lessons he had taught her about courage, determination, and standing up to bullies regardless of the personal cost. Ezekiel Hollis had always maintained that right was ultimately more powerful than might, but only if good people were willing to fight for justice when fighting became necessary. "Where do we go now?" she asked as they reached the relative safety of the canyon's far end. "Mo, back to Silver Creek," Yazi replied without hesitation. It's time to stop running and start taking the fight directly to Pike and his hired killers. But first, they would need allies among the townspeople, and Clara knew exactly where to find the help they desperately needed. The blacksmith's shop sat at the corner of Main Street and Copper Avenue, its forge glowing like a beacon against the December darkness. Tomas Ortega worked late most evenings, taking advantage of the cooler nighttime temperatures to tackle the heavy jobs that would be unbearable during the heat of summer days. The rhythmic ring of hammer-striking anvil had been a constant and comforting sound in Silver Creek for the past 3 years, ever since the young Mexican craftsman had arrived in town with his pregnant wife and dreams of building a better life for his growing family. Clara had always been fond of Tomas. He had a gentle way with children and often repaired broken toys without charge, understanding that frontier families had little spare money for such luxuries. But more importantly, she had noticed things about him that others seemed to miss. The way his face tightened with distaste when Pike's men came around demanding their monthly taxes on his business. The careful distance he maintained from the more brutal enforcers in Pike's organization. The guilty, haunted expression that crossed his features whenever conversation turned to the recent deaths of local ranchers and the mysterious disappearance of families who had opposed Pike's expansion. Tomas Ortega was a man with an active conscience, and Clara was prepared to bet all their lives on that observation. They approached the blacksmith shop carefully through the network of alleys that ran behind Silver Creek's main buildings, moving like shadows through the pools of darkness between street lamps. Through the open doorway of the shop, they could see Tomas working alone at his anvil, shaping a horseshoe with a practiced precision that came from years of experience. His wife Maria would be putting their young son Miguel to bed in the small but comfortable house that sat behind the shop. Yazi's knock on the door was soft but distinctive, the kind of coded signal that frontier scouts used to identify themselves to potentially friendly forces. Tomas looked up from his work hammer, suspended in mid-strike, as he listened to the pattern of sounds. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Clara thought he might raise an alarm or call for Pike's men. Instead, he set down his tools with deliberate care and came to the door. "You should not be here," he said quietly, glancing nervously up and down the street. "Pike has men watching every building in town. They're offering a substantial reward for information about your whereabouts." "Then you already know why we've come," Clara replied, stepping into the circle of light cast by the forge so he could see her face clearly. Tomas studied the three fugitives with obvious internal conflict, written clearly in his dark eyes, and the girl he had watched grow up over the past 3 years, the Navajo scout he had learned to respect despite the cultural barriers that separated them, and the Irish schoolteacher who had always been kind to his family and patient with his son's struggles to learn English. "Come inside," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of a decision that could cost him everything he had worked to build. "But quickly before someone sees you." The interior of the blacksmith shop was warm and smoky, filled with the honest smells of coal fire, hot metal, and hard work honestly done. Tools hung in neat rows along the walls, organized with the precision of a craftsman who took genuine pride in his trade. Finished horseshoes were stacked in carefully arranged pyramids, and half-completed projects occupied designated spaces on various work surfaces. "Maria," Tomas called toward the house. "Bring coffee and food for our guests and close the shutters." Maria Ortega appeared a few minutes later, carrying a tray laden with steaming cups of coffee, fresh tortillas, still warm from the oven, and a pot of beans that smelled like heaven to people who had been living on hardtack and desperation. She was a pretty woman in her mid-20s with intelligent eyes and work-calloused hands that spoke of someone who understood the value of labor and the importance of family. "Clara, mija," she said warmly, though worry creased her features. "We heard you were in terrible trouble. Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" "Not hurt in body." Clara replied honestly, accepting the offered food with gratitude that went beyond mere politeness. "Just scared and tired of running from men who want to silence me permanently." Thomas closed and barred the shop door, and then turned to face his unexpected visitors with an expression that mixed determination and fear in equal measure. "What exactly do you need from us? And please understand, I have a wife and child to think about. I cannot risk their safety lightly. We need information," Yazi said, simply settling his rifle within easy reach, but not in a threatening position. "And perhaps something more, depending on how much courage you can find when justice demands it." Clara studied the blacksmith's face, carefully noting the tension lines around his eyes and the way his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. This was clearly a man carrying a burden too heavy for his conscience to bear comfortably, someone who knew things he wished he could unknown. "You know about Pike's land-grabbing operation, don't you?" she said directly, deciding that subtle approaches would only waste time they didn't have. "You know about the forged documents and the murdered ranchers and all the rest of it." Tomas nearly dropped his coffee cup, hot liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "What makes you think I would know anything about Pike's business dealings?" "Because you've got that look in your eyes that says you know things you wish you didn't," Clara replied, with the blunt honesty of youth. "It's the same expression my father had in the weeks before they killed him. The look of a man who's seen too much evil and doesn't know how to fight back against it." The silence that followed stretched taut as a bowstring with only the crackling of the forge fire and the distant sound of drunken voices from the saloon to break the tension. Maria moved closer to her husband, offering silent support while watching the faces of their visitors with the sharp attention of someone trying to assess dangerous but potentially necessary risks. Finally, Tomas made a decision that would change the course of everything that followed. "There is something I have been hiding." He admitted, his voice heavy with guilt and fear and the weight of secrets too dangerous to keep but too important to reveal carelessly. Evidence that could destroy Pike completely and expose the full extent of his criminal organization if anyone was brave enough to use it and skilled enough to survive the attempt. He led them to a corner of the shop where his largest anvil sat on a massive wooden block that had been specially constructed to handle the tremendous forces involved in heavy metalwork. With considerable effort, he managed to tilt the anvil aside, revealing a hidden compartment that had been carefully carved into the solid wood beneath. From this secret hiding place, he withdrew a leather satchel wrapped in layers of oilcloth to protect its contents from moisture and discovery. "Pike forced me to help transport these documents from Santa Fe to Silver Creek," he explained, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "He said my family would suffer if I refused to cooperate, and he made it very clear what kind of suffering he had in mind." "But you kept copies," Maureen observed, understanding immediately what kind of courage that simple act had required. "I kept copies of everything I could manage without being caught," Tomas confirmed. "I told myself that someday when my son was older and my family was safer, I might find a way to use them against Pike and his organization." The documents contained within the satchel were extraordinary in their scope and damning in their implications. There were genuine territorial correspondence that revealed Pike's connections to corrupt officials throughout New Mexico bank records, showing massive bribes and payoffs, and most damning of all, personal letters that laid out the entire criminal conspiracy in Pike's own handwriting. But there was even more devastating evidence yet to be revealed. "There's something else," Tomas said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper as he reached deeper into the hidden compartment. "Something I witnessed that I've never told another living soul, not even my wife." He withdrew a small leather journal, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting in Pike's distinctive style. Pike is obsessively paranoid about protecting himself from prosecution or betrayal. He keeps detailed records of everything, every bribe paid, every threat made, every witness eliminated. I managed to copy several pages when I was helping transport his personal belongings, and what I found was beyond anything I had imagined possible. Clara's hands trembled as she began reading the journal entries, each one a cold-blooded account of corruption and violence that read like a catalog of evil. There were dozens of entries documenting the systematic elimination of problems ranchers who had refused to sell their land, witnesses who had seen too much, officials who had developed inconvenient consciences. And there, written in Pike's careful script with the casual detachment of someone recording a business transaction, was the entry that confirmed her worst fears. October 7th, 1876. E. Hollis eliminated according to plan. Incident stage to appear as routine range dispute. Problem resolved permanently. Recommend similar approach for future obstacles. The casual way her father's murder had been recorded, like the purchase of supplies or the hiring of additional workers, filled Clara with a rage so pure and intense that it took all her self-control not to scream with fury. But there was still more to be discovered in Tomas's hidden archives. "Look at this entry from a few days before your father's death," Maureen said, pointing to another passage that would prove even more devastating. October 5th E. Hollis continues to refuse final offer for ranch property, growing increasingly suspicious of my motives and methods. Old friendship appears to be compromised beyond repair. Will proceed with permanent solution within 48 hours. Clara felt the world spinning around her as the full implications sank in. Friendship? What friendship? Pike barely knew my father. But Tomas was already digging through more papers, pulling out items he had obviously been saving for years, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. There are letters, too. Old correspondence between your father and Pike, dating back to their service together during the war. He handed Clara a faded letter dated 1863, written in a younger, more optimistic hand than the bitter records they had been reading. The paper was yellow with age and worn soft from repeated handling, but the words were still clearly legible. "Ezekiel, my dear friend." Clara read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't adequately express my gratitude for your heroic actions at the Battle of Glorieta Pass. When that Confederate sharpshooter had me dead to rights with no hope of escape, you threw yourself directly into harm's way, without a moment's hesitation. I owe you my life, and that is a debt I shall carry with honor until my dying day. Your devoted friend, always, Jonas Pike." The revelation struck Clara like a lightning bolt. She had always wondered how Pike had managed to gain her father's trust sufficiently to get close enough for assassination. Now she understood with horrible clarity. Ezekiel Hollis had been murdered by someone he had considered his closest friend, someone whose life he had saved during the war, someone who should have been bound to him by the most sacred of obligations. But the betrayal goes even deeper than that. Tomas continued, his voice growing stronger, as if the act of finally unburdening himself was giving him courage. "There's another letter written just 2 months before your father's death." He produced another document, this one in Ezekiel's careful handwriting, and dated August 1876. Clara recognized her father's distinctive script immediately. The same careful penmanship that had taught her to read and write, the same steady hand. that had signed her birthday cards and written notes for her school lunches. Jonas. She read, fighting back tears that threatened to blur the words. I am writing to express my growing concern about some of the land transactions that have been taking place around Silver Creek in recent months. Good men and honest families are losing their property under circumstances that strike me as highly suspicious, and I cannot shake the feeling that something deeply corrupt is happening in our community. As my oldest and most trusted friend, I'm hoping you can shed some light on these troubling matters. I would hate to think that our friendship might be compromised by business disagreements, but justice and the protection of innocent families must take precedence over personal loyalty. I trust you will understand and help me get to the truth of these matters. Tomas nodded grimly as Clara finished reading. Your father was getting too close to the truth about Pike's operation. He couldn't risk exposure even from his closest friend. Perhaps especially from his closest friend, since Ezekiel's endorsement carried so much weight in the community. Clara's hands shook as the full scope and horror of Pike's betrayal became clear. Not only had he murdered her father in cold blood, but he had violated one of the most sacred bonds known to frontier society, the life debt between men who had saved each other in battle. It was the kind of treachery that went beyond simple greed or even ordinary evil into something that struck at the very foundations of honor and human decency. This changes everything, Maureen said quietly, studying the documents with the careful attention of someone who understood their full significance. With this evidence, we don't just have proof of murder and land fraud. We have documentation of the most despicable kind of betrayal imaginable. We could destroy him completely. Clara said, her young voice carrying a note of steel that would have made her father proud. But only if we can find a way to present this evidence to people who will act on it, instead of being bought off or intimidated into silence. Tomas nodded slowly, his decision crystallizing as he spoke. The territorial judge arrives tomorrow evening for his scheduled New Year's circuit. If we could somehow get these documents into his hands, Pike will never allow us to get anywhere near Judge Morrison. Maria pointed out with the practical wisdom of someone who understood exactly how much power and influence they were challenging. He has too many men under his control, too much influence with local officials. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her mind working furiously as she considered their extremely limited options. Then her face lit up with sudden inspiration and the kind of desperate brilliance that sometimes emerged from impossible situations. The town meeting, she said, excitement building in her voice. Tomorrow night at the church, just before Judge Morrison holds his official court session. Every family in Silver Creek will be there for the traditional year-end community gathering. If we could somehow confront Pike in front of the entire town, force him to face these accusations publicly, that would be suicide. Tomas protested, though Clara could see the idea taking root in his mind, despite his fear. Pike will have guards, hired gunmen from Las Cruces and other places. We'd be walking into a trap with no way out. Maybe... Clara replied, her voice growing stronger with conviction. Or maybe we'd be forcing Pike to show his true nature in front of people who have been too scared to oppose him. Sometimes, the best place to hide from a predator is right out in the open, where everyone can see what's really happening. As they spent the rest of the evening refining their audacious and probably suicidal plan, Clara found herself thinking about her father's lessons regarding courage, honor, and the sometimes terrible price of standing up for what was right. Ezekiel Hollis had always maintained that the strongest weapon against corruption and evil was the simple truth, but only if brave people were willing to shine that light, regardless of the personal consequences. Are you absolutely certain about this course of action? Yazi asked, as they prepared to leave the relative safety of the blacksmith shop. Once we walk into that church tomorrow night, there will be no turning back and no second chances. Clara straightened her shoulders, feeling her father's strength and determination flowing through her veins like liquid courage. "I've been running and hiding for 3 days now. It's time to stop being afraid and start fighting back." But as they slipped back into the darkness of Silver Creek's alleys, none of them could fully anticipate the violence, revelations, and life-or-death struggles that awaited them in the church. The final confrontation was approaching with the inexorable force of an avalanche, and it would test their courage, resolve, and very survival in ways that none of them were fully prepared to face. December 30th dawned clear and bitterly cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made every sound carry for miles across the frozen landscape. Silver Creek's residents went about their morning routines with the subdued but anticipatory energy of people preparing for an important community gathering that happened only once each year. By evening, nearly every family in town would be crowded into the church for the traditional meeting that would set the tone and priorities for the coming year. Clara spent the daylight hours hidden in the Ortega house, helping Maria with household chores, while fighting off successive waves of nervousness about the evening that lay ahead. Through the lace-curtained kitchen window, she could see Pike's men patrolling the streets in greater numbers than usual. The mining foreman was clearly taking no chances with security as the moment of confrontation approached. Segundo and Martinez arrived from Las Cruces this morning. Tomas reported during their midday meal, referring to two notorious gunfighters whose reputations for violence extended far beyond the territorial boundaries. "Pike is assembling what amounts to a small private army." "Good," Clara replied, surprising everyone at the table with her calm confidence. "Let the whole town see exactly what kind of men Pike surrounds himself with. Let them understand what their community has been living under all this time." As the afternoon shadows began lengthening across the snow-covered streets, families throughout Silver Creek began making their way toward the church that sat at the heart of their community. Clara watched through the curtains as neighbors she had known all her life trudged through the drifts, bundled in their best clothes, despite the bitter cold that seemed to cut through even the heaviest coats. These were fundamentally good people. Honest ranchers, hard-working shopkeepers, dedicated craftsmen and their families who deserved so much better than living under Pike's reign of fear and corruption. "Time to go," Yaji announced simply as the church bells began their evening call to gathering. The walk through Silver Creek streets felt like the longest journey of Clara's life, every step bringing them closer to a confrontation that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of everyone who called the town home. Every shadow might conceal one of Pike's gunmen, every doorway could hide an ambush. Every face they passed might belong to someone willing to betray them for Pike's substantial reward money. But as they approached the church, Clara felt her spirits lifting despite the mortal danger they were walking into. The building was packed far beyond its normal capacity, with warm light spilling from every window and the buzz of dozens of conversations, creating an atmosphere of community solidarity that reminded her of better times from her childhood. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with tension and anticipation that everyone could feel, but few understood. Most residents had heard at least fragments of rumors about the missing schoolteacher and the Hollis girl, and everyone sensed that something extraordinary and potentially dangerous was about to unfold. Near the front of the church, in seats that commanded a clear view of the entire assembly, sat Jonas Pike, flanked by Sheriff Dregg and four hard-looking men that Clara didn't recognize, undoubtedly the hired killers from Las Cruces and other lawless places. Pike himself was every inch the distinguished businessman and community leader, dressed in expensive clothes that seemed somehow out of place in the rough frontier town. His graying hair was perfectly groomed, his soft hands were manicured, and his calculating eyes moved constantly across the crowd as he assessed threats and calculated odds. But Clara could see the tension in his carefully maintained composure, the signs of a man who understood that his carefully constructed empire might be about to face its greatest challenge. Reverend Matthews called the meeting to order with his usual dignity, asking for community business to be brought before the assembly for discussion and resolution. For the first several minutes, the proceedings focused on entirely routine matters. Plans for road repairs when the spring thaw arrived, discussions about funding for the school system, proposals for organizing spring planting schedules among the farming families. But undercurrents of tension were palpable throughout the packed building, and every eye in the church kept drifting toward Clara and her companions as they sat near the back waiting for their moment to act. Finally, when she could stand the suspense no longer, Clara rose to her feet. The murmur of routine conversation died instantly as every person in the building turned to look at the slight figure in the worn dress, who had somehow become the center of everyone's attention. "I have something important to say," she announced, her young voice carrying clearly to every corner of the packed church. Pike's response was immediate and smoothly professional, delivered with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to controlling public discourse through a combination of authority and intimidation. "The girl is a wanted fugitive, guilty of theft and disturbing the peace," he said calmly, rising from his seat with casual confidence. "She has no legal standing to address this assembly, and I strongly recommend that she be taken into custody immediately for her own safety and the good of the community." "What exactly did she steal?" called out Thomas Miller, the flour merchant whose children had been among Maureen's most dedicated students. "Important mining company documents," Pike replied, without missing a beat, his voice carrying the ring of injured innocence. "Legal papers taken during a burglary of our offices, along with other valuable property that rightfully belongs to legitimate business interests." Clara felt the familiar flutter of fear in her stomach, but she pushed it down with the inner strength that her father had spent 14 years helping her develop. This was her moment, perhaps the only chance she would ever have to expose the truth and seek justice for her father's murder. "I didn't steal anything," she said clearly, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I found forged land deeds hidden behind the mining depot while I was looking for food scraps to keep from starving. Documents that Mr. Pike plans to use to steal ranches and farms from honest families who built their lives here through hard work and sacrifice." Murmurs began rippling through the crowd, like waves spreading across a pond. And Clara could see the calculation in Pike's eyes as he realized that his usual tactics of intimidation and dismissal weren't going to work against someone who had nothing left to lose. "This is exactly what I would expect from a desperate child who has been living on the streets for months," Pike said with what sounded like genuine sympathy but felt like calculated manipulation. "Miss Hollis has clearly been affected by the hardships and trauma of her recent experiences, and I'm afraid her judgment has been compromised by malnutrition and exposure to the elements." "Oh, my judgment's been affected, all right," Clara shot back with a sharpness that surprised everyone in the church, including herself. "It's been affected by watching my father get murdered by his so-called best friend. It's been affected by being left to starve on the streets while his killer gets rich off stolen land and forged documents." The church fell completely silent, except for the sound of the wind outside and the crackling of the wood stove that provided heat against the December cold. Pike's carefully maintained mask slipped slightly, revealing something cold and dangerous beneath the veneer of respectability. "Careful with your wild accusations, girl," he said softly, but his voice carried clearly to every corner of the building. "Making false statements about respected members of the community can be very dangerous for someone in your precarious position." "You mean dangerous for someone who knows the truth?" Clara replied, feeling momentum building as she saw doubt and curiosity beginning to replace fear in the faces around her. "Someone who's seen your private journal where you write down all your murders like they were grocery lists?" Pike's face went pale, then flushed red, as he realized that his most carefully guarded secrets had somehow been compromised. For the first time since Clara had known of his existence, she saw genuine fear creeping into his calculating eyes. But Yaji was already moving forward through the crowd, carrying Tomas's leather satchel with its devastating contents. Perhaps the assembly would like to examine these so-called delusions for themselves, he said, his voice cutting through the rising murmur of voices like a blade through silk. Pike's hired gunmen shifted restlessly in their seats, hands drifting instinctively toward their weapons. But they were facing more than 50 armed townspeople, crowded into a confined space. Even professional killers had to choose their battles carefully when the odds were so dramatically stacked against them. Yaji opened the satchel with deliberate ceremony and withdrew the forged bill of sale bearing Ezekiel Hollis's signature. This document claims that Ezekiel Hollis sold his ranch to the mining company on October 15, 1876. He announced holding the paper high so everyone could see it clearly, but Ezekiel died on October 7th. Dr. Peterson called out from his seat near the middle of the church. I signed his death certificate myself, and I helped carry his coffin to the cemetery. A collective gasp swept through the assembly as the mathematical impossibility sank in. Ezekiel could not have signed any legal document a week after his burial. The bill of sale was obviously and incontrovertibly forged. Furthermore, Maureen added, standing to address the crowd with her teacher's clear carrying voice, we have documented evidence of systematic corruption involving bribed judges, intimidated witnesses, falsified territorial records, and a conspiracy that reaches back several years and involves the systematic theft of thousands of acres of land. She began reading selected passages from Pike's private journal, her voice growing stronger and more outraged with each revelation. The crowd listened in stunned silence as the full scope of the criminal enterprise became clear, not just isolated incidents of corruption, but a carefully planned and methodically executed campaign to steal the foundation of their entire community. But that's not even the worst of it. Clara said, her young voice cutting through the rising murmur of outrage and disbelief. This was the moment she had been building toward, the revelation that would destroy Pike's reputation beyond any possibility of recovery. She pulled out Ezekiel's wartime letter, the one that would expose Pike's betrayal in terms that every person in the church could understand and condemn. Mr. Pike didn't just murder my father for his land, she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed building. He betrayed their friendship to do it. He killed the man who had saved his life during the war, the friend who trusted him more than anyone else in the world. Pike was on his feet now, his composure cracking visibly as he realized the full extent of his exposure. You have no right to read private correspondence. Those letters were stolen property, and anything in them is taken completely out of context. Out of context. Clara's voice rose with righteous fury that seemed to fill the entire church. Let everyone here judge the context for themselves. Let them hear what my father wrote to his dear friend Jonas just 2 years ago. She began reading aloud from the letter, her clear young voice carrying to every corner of the packed building. Jonas, my dear friend, I cannot adequately express my gratitude for your friendship and loyalty over all these years. The bond that was forged between us during the war when we saved each other's lives and swore eternal brotherhood will never be broken, regardless of what challenges we might face in civilian life. I would trust you with my life, my family, and my most sacred honor without reservation. Your devoted friend, always Ezekiel Hollis. The church erupted into chaos. The revelation that Pike had murdered the man who had saved his life, the friend who had trusted him completely and without reservation, struck the assembled townspeople like a physical blow. Men were jumping to their feet, shouting demands for justice. Women were weeping openly, and the very foundations of the building seemed to shake with collective outrage. Pike's hired gunmen were reaching for their weapons, but before they could clear leather, the crowd surged forward like an angry ocean wave, driven by a fury that had been building for years under Pike's reign of terror. Everyone down! Yaji shouted, but his words were lost in the chaos as Pike drew his silver-plated revolver with desperate speed. The mining foreman's first shot went wild as Thomas Miller tackled one of the hired guns, sending both men crashing into a pew with bone-jarring force. Dr. Peterson dove for cover behind the piano as bullets began flying from multiple directions, turning the peaceful church into a battlefield, where old grievances were being settled with hot lead and righteous fury. Women screamed and children cried as families tried to find cover or escape through the limited exits. But many of the men had come armed and were returning fire with the grim determination of people who had finally reached their breaking point with tyranny and corruption. But Pike wasn't finished with his revelations and threats. As the gunfight raged around him, he managed to grab Clara by the arm, dragging her toward the altar with his gun pressed firmly against her temple. "You want to know about friendship and betrayal?" He snarled in her ear, his voice loud enough to carry over the sound of gunfire and shouting. "Your precious father wasn't the innocent saint you think he was. He made his fortune during the war, selling guns to both sides, profiting from every death and every drop of blood spilled by men braver than himself." Clara struggled desperately in his grip, but Pike was stronger than his soft appearance suggested, and fear gave him additional strength. "That's a lie. My father was a good man who fought for what was right. Ask anyone who knew him before the war if you don't believe me." Pike laughed bitterly, using Clara as a human shield as he maneuvered between the pews while townspeople tried to get clear shots without hitting their young champion. Ezekiel Hollis was a gun runner and a war profiteer who got rich selling death to anyone willing to pay his prices. The only reason he turned righteous in his later years was guilt over all the blood on his hands. The accusation struck Clara like a knife thrust to the heart. But even as she reeled from Pike's words, she found strength in a sudden realization. Even if her father had done terrible things during the war, and she wasn't ready to accept Pike's word on anything, he had spent the rest of his life trying to make amends for past mistakes. He had fought for justice, stood up for the weak, and ultimately died protecting his community from exactly the kind of corruption that Pike represented. Maybe he did make mistakes during the war. Clara said, her voice growing stronger despite Pike's grip on her arm and the gun at her head. But he spent the rest of his life trying to be better. He fought for what was right and died protecting people like you were supposed to protect. What have you done except steal and kill and betray everyone who ever trusted you? Pike's face contorted with rage and desperation as he realized that even his most damaging revelations weren't enough to break the girl's spirit or turn the crowd against her cause. "I did what was necessary to survive and prosper in this God-forsaken territory. In places like this, you're either the wolf or the sheep, and I refuse to spend my life as anyone's dinner." Around them, the battle continued to rage with increasing ferocity. Yaji was exchanging fire with two of Pike's professional gunmen, his old Spencer rifle proving devastatingly accurate despite the chaos and confusion. One of the hired killers was already down, clutching a shoulder wound and trying to stem the flow of blood with his free hand. Maureen had taken cover behind the church organ, using a captured pistol to provide covering fire for families trying to evacuate through the side door. Her teacher's instincts had taken over completely, and she was shepherding children to safety with the fierce protectiveness of a mother hen defending her chicks. But it was Tomas Ortega who would ultimately change the tide of battle. The young blacksmith had worked his way around behind Pike's position, moving between the pews with surprising stealth for such a large and powerful man. When Pike dragged Clara past a supporting pillar, Tomas saw his opportunity and took it without hesitation. "Let her go, you murdering bastard!" the blacksmith roared, launching himself at Pike with all the fury and strength that came from years of swinging heavy hammers and lifting massive pieces of iron. Pike spun toward this new threat, his gun swinging away from Clara's head as he tried to bring it to bear on the charging blacksmith. But instead of firing immediately, he hesitated for a crucial split second, perhaps recognizing the man who had reluctantly helped transport his illegal documents, perhaps simply shocked by this ultimate betrayal from someone he had considered firmly under his control. That moment of hesitation cost him everything he had schemed and killed to achieve. Tomas crashed into Pike with devastating force, his blacksmith strength driving both men to the floor in a tangle of desperate violence. Clara rolled away from the struggling men as quickly as she could, her heart hammering with the realization of how close she had come to death. Pike was more cunning and vicious than strong, fighting with the desperate savagery of someone who understood that capture meant certain execution. As they wrestled for control of the gun, he managed to twist the barrel toward Tomas's chest, his finger tightening on the trigger with deadly intent. "You always were too weak for this business, Tomas," Pike gasped as they fought. "Too concerned with your precious family and your pathetic conscience to do what needed to be done for success and survival. And my family is exactly why I'm fighting you now." Tomas replied through gritted teeth, his powerful hands locked around Pike's wrists as they struggled for control of the weapon. "I won't let my son grow up in a world poisoned by your corruption and evil." The gun discharged with a sound like thunder in the confined space of the church. For a heart-stopping moment, Clara couldn't tell who had been shot. Both men lay motionless on the blood-stained floor, and she feared the worst as silence fell over their section of the ongoing battle. Then Tomas stirred, pushing Pike's still form away from him with obvious effort. The bullet had found its intended target, but not the one Pike had aimed for. Jonas Pike lay dead on the church floor, his calculating eyes staring sightlessly at the wooden cross that hung above the altar he had tried to defile with his presence. His dreams of empire and his years of careful scheming had finally come to their inevitable end. But the victory had come at a terrible cost. Tomas was badly wounded, Pike's bullet having torn through his shoulder before ricocheting and finding its final resting place in Pike's own chest. Blood was spreading across the blacksmith's shirt at an alarming rate, and his face was already going pale from shock and blood loss. "Is he going to be all right?" Clara asked frantically as Dr. Peterson rushed to examine the fallen hero. "Now he'll live," the doctor said after a quick but thorough examination. But it was closer than I'd like to admit. Another few inches in any direction and the bullet would have hit something vital. He's going to need immediate medical attention and several weeks of recovery, but he should make a complete healing with proper care. As the immediate crisis of Tomas's wound was being addressed, Clara became aware that the larger battle was still raging throughout the rest of the church. Pike's remaining gunmen were making their last stand near the main entrance, trapped between the fury of aroused townspeople and the solid stone walls of the building. "Surrender now, and you might live to see tomorrow." Yaji called out his rifle trained on the two surviving hired killers. "Your boss is dead, and your cause is lost. There's no point in dying for a dead man's money." But the gunmen were professionals who understood exactly what their fate would be if they were taken alive by an angry mob seeking justice for years of intimidation and abuse. They chose to go down fighting rather than face the certainty of a rope and a short drop, making one final desperate charge toward the door with guns blazing. They didn't make it more than 3 steps before the combined firepower of a dozen outraged townspeople cut them down in a hail of bullets that ended Pike's reign of terror once and for all. The Battle of Silver Creek was finally over. As the gun smoke cleared and the immediate crisis passed, Clara found herself once again sitting on the church steps, staring out at the town that had been transformed by their desperate struggle for justice. The building behind her bore the scars of battle bullet holes in the walls, broken windows, overturned pews, but it had survived just as the community itself had survived Pike's attempts to destroy it from within. Yazi settled beside her on the cold stone steps, his own wounds bound, but his spirit finally at peace for the first time in 12 years. "How do you feel?" He asked gently the same question he had posed after each of their previous confrontations. This time, Clara's answer came from a deeper understanding of the complexity of justice and the true cost of fighting for what was right. "Sad for all the pain and death that was necessary," she said honestly. "Sad that it had to come to violence and bloodshed, but also relieved that the nightmare is finally over and our community can begin healing from years of fear and corruption." Inside the church, The surviving townspeople were already beginning to organize themselves for the tremendous task of rebuilding their community's institutions and restoring trust in local government. With Pike dead and his criminal organization shattered, Silver Creek could finally begin the long process of recovery and renewal. 2 days later, on New Year's Day, 1877, Circuit Judge Morrison arrived in Silver Creek to find a town completely transformed from what he had expected. Instead of the routine legal business he had planned to conduct, he was presented with one of the most extensive and well-documented cases of corruption and conspiracy in the history of the New Mexico Territory. The evidence was overwhelming in both quantity and quality. Pike's private journal with its detailed accounts of bribery and murder, the forged land documents with their impossible dates, and fraudulent signatures testimony from dozens of witnesses who had been too terrified to speak out while Pike was alive, and physical proof of criminal activity that spanned several years and involved thousands of acres of stolen property. Judge Morrison was known throughout the territory for his thoroughness and attention to detail, and he examined every piece of evidence with meticulous care. But the outcome was never really in doubt, and the case against Pike's organization was simply too strong and too well documented for any other conclusion to be reached. "Miss Hollis," the judge said, as he concluded the formal legal proceedings that had been conducted in the battle-scarred church, "your courage in exposing this massive conspiracy has prevented one of the greatest miscarriages of justice I have encountered in 30 years on the bench. Dozens of families would have lost their homes and livelihoods if these forged documents had been allowed to stand as legal truth." Clara sat in the makeshift courtroom that had been established where she had fought for her life just days before, flanked by Yaji and Maureen and surrounded by the townspeople who had risked everything to support her cause. The building still bore obvious scars from the gunfight, but it had been cleaned and repaired sufficiently to serve its new purpose as a symbol of justice restored. "What happens to my father's ranch now, Your Honor?" she asked, though she already suspected what the answer would be. "The ranch and all associated property rights are hereby restored to you as the sole heir of Ezekiel Hollis." Judge Morrison replied with the satisfaction of someone who enjoyed correcting injustices. "All forged documents purporting to transfer ownership to Pike's mining company are declared null and void, and any improvements or modifications made to the property during the period of illegal occupation will become part of your inheritance." Clara felt a tremendous wave of relief wash over her, but it was tempered by the practical realities of her situation. "I'm deeply grateful, sir, but I'm only 14 years old. I don't think I have the knowledge or experience necessary to manage a working ranch by myself." Judge Morrison smiled with the benevolent expression of someone who enjoyed delivering good news. "That matter has already been addressed through your father's foresight and careful planning. Ezekiel Hollis was apparently a much more prudent man than even his closest friends realized." Clara's heart began racing with anticipation. Her father had never mentioned anything about arrangements for her care in the event of his death. According to a will that was properly executed and legally witnessed 3 years ago. The judge continued consulting his papers with obvious satisfaction. "Ezekiel Hollis appointed a guardian to oversee your welfare and assist in managing your inheritance until you reach the age of majority." "Who did he choose?" Clara asked, though something in the judge's expression suggested she might already know the answer. According to the document, which has been thoroughly examined and verified as authentic, Judge Morrison announced, "Ezekiel Hollis appointed Yazi of the Navajo Nation as your legal guardian, with full authority to act in your interests and manage your property until you turn 18. The announcement created a buzz of surprised conversation throughout the courtroom. Clara turned to look at Yazi, seeing her own amazement reflected in his weathered features. Neither of them had any idea that Ezekiel had made such arrangements. But as Clara thought about it, the choice made perfect sense. "Your Honor," Yaji said slowly, clearly struggling with the magnitude of the responsibility being offered to him. I am deeply honored by Ezekiel's trust and confidence. But I am not certain that I am qualified to serve as guardian to a young white woman. The cultural differences, the social complications, character and integrity matter far more than cultural background. Clara interrupted firmly, thinking of everything they had endured together and everything this man had risked to protect her. If my father trusted you with my life and my inheritance, then so do I completely and without reservation. Will you accept the appointment? Yaji studied Clara's face for a long moment, seeing not just the courageous girl who had exposed Pike's conspiracy, but a young woman of remarkable strength and determination, who had already proven herself capable of extraordinary things. In her eyes, he saw echoes of the daughter he had lost so many years ago, and perhaps a chance for the redemption that had eluded him since the long walk. I accept, he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of a sacred vow. The legal proceedings continued throughout the morning as Judge Morrison systematically dismantled what remained of Pike's criminal empire and restored stolen property to its rightful owners. Sheriff Dregg was stripped of his badge and sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison for his role in the conspiracy. The few surviving members of Pike's organization faced various charges depending on their level of involvement, while the honest citizens of Silver Creek began the process of electing new leadership based on integrity rather than fear. Maureen Callahan was officially commended by the territorial government for her courage in protecting Clara and exposing the conspiracy. The Education Department provided substantial funding to rebuild and expand the school system, and the new facility would be renamed in her honor, as a permanent reminder of the price and value of standing up for what was right. Tomas Ortega was cleared of all charges related to his forced participation in Pike's organization and was hailed throughout the territory as a hero whose courage had helped bring down one of the most extensive criminal conspiracies in frontier history. His blacksmith shop became busier than ever as the community worked to repair the damage from years of corruption and intimidation. As the court session concluded and Judge Morrison prepared to continue his circuit, Clara walked with Yaji toward the edge of town and the ranch that would now become their shared home and responsibility. At her father's grave, she knelt once more among the winter flowers that had been placed there by grateful townspeople. I kept my promise, Papa, she said softly, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The ranch is safe, and the people who hurt you can never hurt anyone else. I hope you're proud of what we accomplished, even though I had to learn some hard truths about your past along the way. Yaji placed a gentle protective hand on her shoulder. Your father was a man who made mistakes in his youth, but spent the rest of his life trying to make amends and build something better. That kind of redemption takes more courage than never failing in the first place. He would indeed be proud of what you have accomplished and the woman you are becoming. As they stood together in the cemetery, Clara found herself reflecting on everything that had happened since Christmas Eve, and all the lessons she had learned about courage, justice, friendship, and the sometimes terrible price of doing what was right. She had lost her childhood innocence and been forced to take a human life, but she had also discovered inner strength she never knew she possessed, and found a family built on something stronger than blood relationships. What do you think the future holds for us? She asked as they prepared to leave the cemetery and begin their new life together. Yaji looked out over the snow-covered landscape that stretched toward the mountains, seeing not just the harsh realities of frontier existence, but also the endless possibilities that lay ahead for people with the courage to pursue them. Whatever challenges come our way, we will face them together as families should. That is the most important lesson your father left us, that the bonds created by shared struggle and mutual respect are stronger than any obstacle we might encounter. As they walked toward the ranch house that would need extensive repairs and improvements, Clara felt a deep sense of completion that she hadn't experienced since her father's death. The battle for Silver Creek was over, justice had been served, and the corrupt empire built on lies and violence had finally fallen to the power of truth courageously spoken. But more importantly, she had discovered something she hadn't even realized. She was seeking a new definition of family that had nothing to do with blood relationships and everything to do with the bonds forged through shared trials, mutual sacrifice, and the kind of love that was earned rather than simply inherited. Walking beside Yaji through the countryside toward their home, Clara no longer felt like an orphaned child abandoned by fate and circumstance. She was the heir to a complex but ultimately honorable legacy, the guardian of hard-won justice, and a young woman ready to face whatever challenges the frontier might bring with the support of someone who understood the true meaning of honor and sacrifice. Behind them, Silver Creek began its slow but determined transformation from a community ruled by fear and corruption to a town built on the solid foundations of justice, mutual respect, and shared commitment to the common good. The story of the girl who found truth and justice in Christmas Eve refused would be told and retold for generations to come, inspiring future residents to stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost or the power of those who opposed them. But for Clara herself, walking beside her guardian and protector toward a future full of possibility and promise, in the most important part of the story, was just beginning. The frontier stretched ahead of them like an unwritten book, vast and challenging, but no longer threatening, and she was ready to help write the next chapter with courage, wisdom, and the unshakable conviction that right would ultimately triumph over might when good people found the strength to stand together. The wind that had once seemed so cold and threatening now sang through the canyon walls with a sound full of hope and renewal, the voice of a land that had weathered many storms and would weather many more, sustained by the unbreakable spirit of those who called it home and were willing to fight for the principles that made life worth living.